Hey, what's going on everyone? Axel here. Today we're going to talk about console controllers. I'm going to take you back starting with the NES and going all the way up to the new consoles. We're going to talk about all the controllers, which ones are my favorites, which ones I think are the best, which ones I think were hits, which ones I think were misses. Now, I don't have every single controller. I have most of them starting back from the NES and going to the new consoles. I have most of them. Not all of them. So for the ones I don't have, I'll say a few things, but I won't be able to actually show it to you. But for the other ones, I do have them presented here. I have most of the controllers for the major consoles. So let's get started way back with the original NES controller. And this is actually one of my favorite controllers. And also, by the way, I didn't say this, but before we get started, I didn't mention this before, but at the end of the video, I'll go over my 5 favorite controllers of this lot, my 5 favorite controllers of all time. So let's get started with the NES. I think this is actually a surprisingly good controller. It is very, very, very simple, but you have to think about what kind of games that this thing used back in the day. This thing was used for very simple games, 2D platformers. You didn't need much more than this. This was honestly simple and perfect. It was an example of not overdoing it, not thinking too hard. At the time, this was actually a gimmick controller because before this, we had things like the Atari 2600 that were basically joystick controllers. And this was the first one to really introduce this D-pad, which now is a staple, but back then it was a gimmick. So it was very revolutionary, very groundbreaking, and I find that despite its reputation, I find that the standard box controller is actually pretty comfortable. And even though I actually have, let me show it to you, I have the quote-unquote improved variation of this, the dog bone. I actually have one of these, but I still prefer this standard controller when I go back and play the NES today, when I play my NES. So yeah, I think it's one of the better controllers, and I think for me at least, it has aged better than for adults anyway, than this next controller, which is the Super Nintendo controller. The Super Nintendo controller, while I like this as a kid, I find that the NES controller is actually better for adults today. That's because this was really made for small hands, and now the NES controller was as well, but this introduced the shoulder buttons. And I don't feel, the reason I would put the NES controller above is I feel that for adults, for bigger hands, the shoulder buttons are just really awkward to use on this. Now it works great for kids, but without the hand grips that you see on modern controllers, these shoulder buttons I feel really are a little bit weird to use nowadays for adults, which is why I think the NES controller is better. Also, the Super Nintendo controller was used to play some 3D games, stuff like Super Mario RPG. We saw some 3D games make their way into the realm of gaming during this time with the Super Nintendo in the early 90s. And I just don't I think that when the Super Nintendo controller came around, I just feel like this design was a little more outdated, whereas the NES controller was very simple, but it worked great for the type of games on that system. So let's go ahead and jump to the next generation. Now I don't have the N64 controller. I'll go ahead and talk about that now actually, but the N64 controller I actually do not like at all. I had one, I actually got rid of it about 2 months ago along with my NES N64 just because I wasn't playing it, and I had a friend who wanted it, so I let him have it. It actually wasn't mine in the first place, so it was his. He let me borrow it for a while. But anyways, I don't like the N64 controller because it just didn't age well. It was innovative at its time, but it's not something you ever want to go back today after having used your standard current gen console dual joystick controllers, something like the Xbox One controller. The design has just improved so much since the N64 controller, and just going back and trying to play those type of games with a single joystick, it's just not good. And even back in the day, the controller was really controversial because you hold it and you don't really know which way to hold it. There's really 2 ways. You can use it for like Mario 64 style with one hand on the joystick, or you can put 2 hands on the side and use it kind of like a Nintendo, like a classic Nintendo NES controller. But I don't feel it works that well. It was a controller that was made specifically for Mario 64, but it's just a design that's been improved so much that going back to it today is just so awkward. Now, similarly, let's talk about the GameCube controller. The GameCube controller was like the N64 controller, made for one specific game. The N64 controller was made for Mario 64, and the GameCube controller was made specifically for Smash Brothers, and it's perfect for that game. And I'm someone I play Smash Brothers all the time, still today, and I love it. But it's perfect for that game. You've got A for attack. You got your surrounding buttons here. The C stick, while it's awkward to use for shooters, it's perfect for Smash Brothers because you can quickly flick it to do a smash, like a power attack. If you're not familiar with Smash Brothers, you use the C stick to perform a smash attack, which is your more powerful attacks. And it's just a controller that works so well today, and it's used still today. One of the most popular esports today is Super Smash Bros. Melee for the GameCube, and players just worship this controller like a religion, and they refuse to use any other controllers. And Nintendo has actually re-released this controller today for the new Smash Bros. Wii U game. So, okay, now that one's done, next let's jump to the PS1 controller. PS1 controller I actually really like. It's one of my favorites, and I actually like it better than the PS2 controller, which is weird to say because the PS2 controller is the same controller, just with joysticks added essentially. There's a few other things, but the main difference between the PS1 and the PS2 is just the analog sticks that were added. So why do I like the PS1 better when it's essentially the same as the PS2, just without joysticks? Well, because one, without the joysticks, it's a lot lighter. And I think for the type of games it was used for, it worked really well. Now, certainly it didn't work well for, say, when people started getting into the PS1, developers started really getting into it. They started making games like the original Resident Evil, which did not work well with the D-pad. A lot of 3D games didn't. But I just feel overall that the comfort of this controller just makes up for the lack of the joysticks. And while the joysticks were an improvement, I feel it's kind of... I personally have never liked Sony's design, even though the PS2 was probably my most played console of all time. I feel like the Xbox 360 version with where the joysticks are separated, like the 360 controller was and the Xbox One controller are, with the joystick up here and down here, is just a lot more intuitive way to play. That's just basically an opinion, but I've always felt that way. So that's why I like the PS1 controller better than the PS2 controller. The PS2 controller is okay, but like I explained further, I'm just not a fan of the joysticks being on the bottom. I feel it's just not quite as comfortable to have to kind of bend your fingers and play with these joysticks on the bottom. One of the other flaws of this controller is the joysticks. I always felt they are a little bit too loose, and I actually had problems playing first-person shooters on this controller. Now, for adventure games, maybe RPGs, things like that, it was fine because these were fine for movement, but they just had the resistance level was just too low for me to really get that pinpoint accuracy in a game like, say, 007 Nightfire. And I actually, for games like that, for shooters on the PS2, I actually used this, which is a off-brand Pelican brand PS2 controller. The main differences are the sticks are a little bit smaller and they're a little tighter. So I felt like using this got me that better accuracy I needed in a first-person shooter. Okay, so let's move forward another generation with the Wii. And again, I don't have every system. I don't have the original Xbox controller, unfortunately. I do have an Xbox One, so I sort of have experience with that. I don't have the Xbox 360 controller either, but I have played them some, and I do like the Xbox 360 controller, but again, I can't really talk a lot about it because I never owned an Xbox 360 or an original Xbox. I do have an Xbox One, though. So let's just go ahead and jump forward to the Wii. So here's the Wii remote and the nunchuck, and man, I really have never liked this. I do have a Wii. I have a Wii U. I think this was probably one of the worst controllers ever made. It just didn't work very well. Nintendo built the Wii system around motion controls, and while they worked okay for some things like rail shooters, I found overall that the controller just lacked that a fundamental control scheme, and it's clearly, when using it on the side, it's clearly inferior to the SNES or the NES controller because it's just too skinny and the D-pad's just too small and the buttons are too small to be all that comfortable. And with this controller, a lot of people really hate the Wii. A lot of casual players liked it, and it was good for stuff like I said, like rail shooters and stuff like Wii Sports. It was okay, but overall, it didn't. A lot of people just wanted a real controller, and there's so many games on the Wii that forced you to use motion controls, and a lot of games, like say something like Donkey Kong Country Returns, which I really liked, but it forced you to use motion controls, and I just didn't want to do that. I just wish there was an option to play with regular controls. Similarly, a game like Wario Land Shake It, same thing. It was built around the motion controls, and there were just so many games like that on the Wii that forced you to use motion controls. Even stuff like Super Mario Galaxy, which caused you to plug this thing in the nunchuck to use as your directional pad. I admit there's some appeal in being able to separate your hands and kind of lay them on your side as you're playing, but it's still awkward to use. So, not a fan of the Wii controller. And despite what anyone says, the motion controls never really worked because you could always manipulate them in some way. There's always a way to manipulate the controls, which kind of took away the whole point for me of motion controls. Something like Wii Sports Bowling, you didn't have to actually go through the whole movement of bowling with your arm like you would in real life. You can actually just get the controller and just go like that, and it does the same thing. So that, to me, when you can just get around motion controls by just half-assing them, it just defeats the whole purpose of motion controls for me. So let's go to another Wii controller, the Wii Classic controller, which is not a bad controller. As you might have noticed, it's very similar to the PS2 controller, which is why I kind of have the same opinion of this as I do the Wii Classic or the PS2 controller. It's one positive is it's super light. It doesn't have a battery. You actually have to plug this damn thing into the Wii remote to get it to work. It doesn't have its own battery. It doesn't even have a way to sync to the console by itself. It has to rely on this, which sucks. But the good thing about that is it is light. I always felt like this controller felt a little cheap. The control sticks they're really tight, but they just I've just never liked them that much. They also lack what even the PS2 controller had, which is an RB button, which is a joystick button where you press the joystick down. Say like you're playing Call of Duty, you can press or something. Let's say something like Deus Ex. You press the control stick down to aim. This doesn't even have that option at all. These are just solid joysticks stuck into this. So that's a little weird, and it kind of limits your control options when you're playing, say, a first-person shooter or a third-person shooter. Like I played through Resident Evil 4 on this thing, and I really I played the Wii version of Resident Evil 4, and I really missed that feature. But overall, it's an alright controller. I do like it for one thing. It is compatible with the Wii U and the Wii. And the one thing I do like about this is something that the PS2 shares, is that the D-pad is in, for me, a very ergonomic position. It sits right here, right at your finger, and that's something I don't like about the next controller I'll discuss, the Wii U Pro controller, is that you see the location of the D-pad. I've never liked the Wii U Pro controller for this location. It's always been very awkward to play 2D games because of the location of the D-pad. I've always felt it's a lot more natural to have it resting up on top where your thumb would naturally lay. So actually, when I want to play a 2D game, say like Shovel Knight on the Wii U, I will actually just use this controller. And fortunately, that is an option. So it works out kind of for me because I'll use this for 2D games and this for 3D games. So that works out. But let's go on to the Wii U Pro, because except for the D-pad feature, this is probably my favorite controller of all time when it comes to playing 3D games. For me, I wish that more I think this is the optimal control scheme location for the joysticks on a controller meant to be used for 3D games, because what does your hand naturally lay when you touch a controller? It naturally lays on top. That's where your thumb naturally lays. So for something like shooters, this to me is perfect. I don't get cramps from having playing like a PS2 controller, having to hold my thumbs down here. They just lay naturally right here on the spot. And likewise, my thumbs, my forefingers lay directly on the triggers, no issues. And I actually prefer triggers like this on a controller that don't have deep indentions, unlike we see on, say, the Xbox One controller, which has really deep indentions. It's an actual trigger, whereas these are just buttons. I've never really understood why they build triggers into the controllers. Even for first-person shooters, I find just buttons to be better because your reaction time is quicker, because there's less, they're not as deep, so you can just press them and, say, throw a grenade, shoot your gun, instead of having to pull your finger all the way down. That's just a personal preference, but it's something I've noted. Also, the battery life on this thing is amazing. This thing will last for weeks and weeks and weeks on one charge. It's great right out of the box. It's great, and it's also pretty light. Now, actually, let's go ahead and talk about this one, the Wii U gamepad. This is essentially this, just with a screen in the middle. The button layouts are all the same. This thing's actually surprisingly pretty light. Now, I do have this rubberized coating on it, which adds some weight, but this thing's actually surprisingly light. However, the Wii U kind of crashed and burned because of this thing, and there's a reason for it. There's really no reason to use it in most games over this. This is just a superior option. While the Wii U was marketed and built around the use of this screen, the funny thing is Nintendo actually hardly ever utilized it in their games. There's only a handful of games that really utilize it. Now, when I say really utilize it, I mean actually use it as a core component of the game. There's very few games that actually do this that are first-party Nintendo titles. Like, I think Star Fox Zero does it, but other than that, it's just gimmicks. Like Mario Kart 8, there's really no use for this screen. It's a gimmick. Like, it shows a horn button and you can push it, but nothing substantial. There's a lot of games where, like, your inventory might show up on here or a map, but there's really no use. There's very few games that actually use this in a good way. Like, the only one I can think of off the top of my head that really utilized this thing was Zombie U, which actually used the second screen as a gamepad. Some other things like Deus Ex, not Mankind Divided, that's the new one, Deus Ex Human Revolution, used it somewhat for the augmentation system and the mapping system, but even then it was kind of a supplementary thing that could have just been on the main TV screen. But anyways, back to the controller. It's surprisingly light. It's not too bad to use. There's just no reason to use it most of the time over this. It even has a little camera on it. It has a microphone in it, which unfortunately, again, hardly ever used. I don't know of a single game that uses the webcam. I can only think of one game that uses the microphone, and that's Nintendo Land for one game. So yeah, unfortunately, it's just not too great. The upside to this is you can play off the TV screen, which is really the only upside, but since it's tied to the console and it only has a range of maybe 15 feet, it's kind of not a great feature. So decent controller, just no reason to use it, and it really was never worth the big bloat it caused in terms of the Wii's price. Without this thing, the Wii U could be going for like $200 right now, because these things cost like $80 to $100 or something for Nintendo to produce each. So, all right, last controller. Let's talk about the Xbox One controller. And again, I don't have the PS3 controller. I don't have the PS4 controller either, although I really like the PS4 controller, and I think it's a solid improvement over both the PS3 and the PS2 controllers. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the one I do have, which is the Xbox One controller. I'm not a fan of this because a couple reasons. Unlike the Wii U Pro, the joysticks, instead of being convex, are concave. And I've never really understood that. I've always felt it to be an inferior design. And I know that Xbox has always used that design. And I know a lot of people do like it, but I've never understood why. I guess the argument is it gives you somewhere to lay your fingers. But for me, I've always, when I'm playing a 3D game or first-person shooter, I've always enjoyed having the convex buttons there to keep my finger from sliding off. And this encourages you to put your finger down and in to the concave indentation, and I've just never wanted to hold a controller like that. I've always wanted to hold a controller with my thumb over it, which in this case, if I'm holding it like that, I'm not using this convex portion anyways, because my finger is not really utilizing it unless I stick the top of my finger, top of my thumb in it. So I've never really understood that. I don't like that design choice. I do think the design of having one up top, one down low in terms of joysticks is a superior design as opposed to what the PS2 does. Now I don't think it's as good as what the Wii U controller does have, but at least if you're using this for a 2D game, at least the buttons to me are in a more ergonomic position instead of being down here where this other controller would be. So that's something it does have over the Wii U Pro, but I still would rather have the two joysticks up here because in today's games especially, they're almost all 3D. There's very few 2D games. So the downside, a couple downsides, this controller is actually really heavy. Even without batteries in it, which I don't have batteries in it right now, it still feels really heavy. Like this thing, even without batteries, feels substantially heavier than the Wii U Pro with batteries. And I don't really understand why this controller is so heavy, but it's really heavy. And that actually makes it a little less comfortable, I've noticed, if I'm actually going through a long gaming session. So I don't like that. The top buttons are really controversial because they went with a different design. The front bumper, the front buttons, the front bumpers are kind of raised up, which the whole point of that is to be able to put one finger on the trigger and kind of be able to roll your finger instead of actually doing what you used to do on other controllers like the PS2 controller where you would just move your finger back and forth between the buttons. And that's something they really, Microsoft invested a lot of R&D into, and they really wanted to take a chance with this controller and try to teach people how to utilize it properly. But I just felt like there wasn't enough reward for that. I know the argument is that it can take less time to say to throw a grenade in Call of Duty instead of having to move your finger up over and hit this button. You can just roll your thumb and kind of keep push this button without moving your finger. But I just felt like it's still not all that comfortable, and I would just rather have the old. I think the other design, while being less efficient than this bumper design, is more comfortable. So, and I think comfort always has to trump efficiency. I mean, unless I'm playing an esport, I'm always going to want comfort over efficiency. Or unless I'm playing a game competitively for some reason. The other downside is this controller actually, this is the only controller today I can think of that's bundled with a system that doesn't come with a rechargeable battery. It comes with standard AA's. I mean, I guess Microsoft does that so they can cut a little bit of price off the system, but I still think it should come with a rechargeable battery. And you actually have to pay like $14-15, something like that, to buy a rechargeable battery separate. So I haven't liked that. Another downside of this controller, which is, I know I'm adding on the reasons why I don't like it. As you can tell, this is not one of my favorite controllers of the current consoles. This D-pad sucks. It's really clicky. There's a ton of resistance to each of these buttons, and I think the logic behind that is that this controller really wasn't built for 2D games. It was more it's more built for 3D games, I think, where this D-pad wasn't used for movement. It was just kind of used as an options menu. But even then, I don't see why they would have had to make the buttons this clicky and this resistant. So yeah, overall, I'm not a fan of this controller, and I'm starting to regret buying an Xbox One over a PS4 because of that. I went with an Xbox One just because I had never owned a Microsoft console before, and I got a really good deal on it. I got like $100 less than I would have had to pay for a PS4. So. But yeah, overall, I think the PS4 controller, while I don't own one, I've used it a lot, like in GameStops and things. I find that that's a superior controller to the Xbox One. So that's all for the controllers, guys. Now to go over my top 5 list of the controllers you can see here. My number 5 pick, I would have to say the GameCube controller would be my number 5 favorite of all time. Number 4 would be, where did I put it? Okay, the NES controller. Number 4 for me is the NES controller. Number 3 on my list is the PS2 controller. Number 2 is the PS1 controller, and all these for reasons I previously explained in this video. And my favorite controller of all these that I've shown to you today, and still my favorite controller of all time today, is the Wii U Pro controller. And it's a shame that this thing, from what I've heard, is not going to be compatible with a backwards compatible with the Nintendo Switch, because I absolutely love playing 3D games on this controller. It's my favorite controller of all time. I think it's perfect for 3D games. I think it's perfect in terms of battery life is amazing. I think that the joystick location is optimal. It's super light, battery lasts forever. Really comfortable trigger, really light controller. I just love it, and I wish there were more games for it. And I wish I could use this controller to play my Xbox One, honestly. So guys, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed just listening to my thoughts about controllers from consoles through the years. Please comment below and let me know what you think of my opinions, what your favorite controllers of all time are, and what you think of my top 5 list. That's all for today, guys. Thanks for watching, and feel free to subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this in the future. That's all for today. You all have a good one. Thanks for watching. Take care.